Hello, I'm Karma Kitaj, your host for A Livelihood, New Adventures as We Age. And today I'm going to introduce you to Alan O'Hare, who directs a theater group and who's been a playwright, an educator, and a community psychologist. And most interestingly to me, he is a storyteller called a Shawnee. We will hear about that. So welcome, Alan.
Well, thank you. It's always wonderful to have an opportunity to share the story and discover the story. Thank you.
Yes. So we need to find out about a Shawnee.
Well, the Shawnee goes back about 2,500 years. It's similar to the griot of Africa, similar to the Anansi of Haiti and Jamaica. So each culture has their own
tradition all over the world, I guess.
Yes. Every culture has its own storyteller, one that holds the story and then gathers the stories from the people of the village and the community, and it's a way of linking them together. It predates printing. Tradition of all storytellers is the stories are everywhere because we are the story. Ultimately, each person is their own story.
So how did you get interested in the idea of being a Shawnee?
Well, I mean, I think it's in my heritage. I mean, psychologically, I go back and I think just from childhood, early childhood, the story was a wonderful experience. I grew up in the Dorchester area of Boston. Both my parents were from Ireland. My father was from the West Coast, my mother from the East Coast, and they met here in this country. And they worked full-time jobs, and they also ran a boarding house. So from the moment I was born, and then my brother, there were always 3 boarders in our house. And in addition to that, my father was famous for bringing people home. My father was not a storyteller per se. What he was a person who loved stories, and he would bring the stories home.
And you said he was a very good listener.
Oh, he was a wonderful listener. He just would listen to them, and then these people would start telling the stories, and he would gather them together, and then people would just simply listen to these stories. Oftentimes we never saw some of these people ever again, but we'd remember their stories. But the time when I really discovered about what the roots of my heritage of the Shawnee was, I think it was about 9 years old, and we went over to visit some cousins.
Over to Ireland?
No, over to Roxbury.
Over to Roxbury.
Not very
far away.
There was a cousin of ours, a distant cousin named Tom Brogan, who lived up in the far woods of Maine, who would once a year come down to visit. And he was a Shawnee. And he would enter the room of these adults of all ages, and they would transform. They would just listen to him. And he would tell stories. And he'd say, Pat, what's been going on with the work here? And he'd get my father or he'd get another person to tell a story. And then he'd say, it's interesting you tell that story now, Pat, because I just met another man that's just like... And then he'd start weaving the stories together. And then all of a sudden he'd break into song. And he said, how many of you know that song? And then he'd have them all sing. I had never heard any of these people sing before except in church, formal service. But then and it was just this wonderful, magical experience. And so, and I realized it was something I loved because it wasn't just the telling of the story, it was the hearing of the story. And the true storyteller is not only a teller, but it was somebody who loves the exchange, what flows on and goes on. And so.
And as you say, someone who's a good listener and who's also adept at eliciting stories from other people. So you have parlayed this wonderful facility for listening to stories and telling stories into something big that you've... So I know you write plays, but you also elicit stories from people in all different kinds of places. So can you tell us something about that?
One of the places I did was a community of nuns called the Sisters of St. Joseph. They're based, their mother house is in Brighton, and they have been around since the late 1700s. They originally came from France, and so I've known some of the nuns over the years. I was educated by the Sisters of St. Joseph in high school, And I was always in admiration of them, and I liked their teaching style. And they were going to celebrate an experience, an anniversary, and they had asked me to talk with them about their stories. And so I met with many of the nuns and just listened to their stories. And many of them were in their 60s, 70s, even some in their 80s, and then there were some younger ones. And it was about trying to find what was the heart of their story. I mean, each of them were devoted to service. I mean, they were devoted to a life of prayer. They were devoted to a life of community. And they were devoted to sharing the experience of their faith with other people. And so what I did was I simply listened to them. But then it was trying to create a play out of that was, so what makes this dramatically worthy? And so for me, I am a visual person, but also I love music. So when I'm listening to people talk, I'm also listening to the music in their voice. The melody that they talk in, but also what are the words, what are the stories they say that associate a piece of music. And music can be classical, it can be a more folk tune, but somewhere along the line it comes. And I realized what I was trying to do was bring together stories of remembrance. But for me, there was something about their way of speaking that had music to it. So the title soon became Songs of Remembrance. And so one of the ideas that came out of that was, well, there's seasons of their life. And so it was the season of the community. And the seasons that we came up with are the season of mystery, the season of roots, the season of loss, the season of promise, and the season of miracles. So those are the 5 seasons of their lives. I think when a person's really telling their story, even if they're not, quote, a professional storyteller, when they're telling that story, they feel alive. And the aliveness may be in their sadness. It may be in something that they still feel enraged about. Oftentimes I've talked to people who come from lands of cultural oppression, and you can still feel the anger that they feel with what took place at that time. But in the telling of it, that they feel heard, there's something liberating for that.
So that reminds me that you did receive an honor for some of your work. Why don't you talk about that particular honor from the Seton Award? Right?
Yes, it's the Elizabeth Seton Award. It's from the Sisters of Charity of Halifax, and they're based in, their mother house is in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but they have a center in Wellesley Hills. They have a nursing home attached to it, many of whom are nuns, but they also have some lay people who are people various levels of Alzheimer's state, so various stages. And so the concern of the staff was how to help them become more engaged, these residents. So they hired me to spend a year with them, and I would go in there one day a week on Tuesdays, and I'd arrive around 7, I'd be there till about 4, and I would just simply spend the day wandering through there and sometimes do small groups and just listen to their stories, some of which would be repeated because of their, the condition of the Alzheimer's. And sometimes there would be a story that would come out of nowhere that would be never retrieved again. And my task was simply to remember them. And later I'd write them all down. And I had this wonderful collection of these stories. And every time one of these people whose memory was fading would remember something, they were alive. I mean, they were there again. And the order, the congregation of the Sisters of Elizabeth, the Sisters of Charity is what they're called, gave me this award at some banquet, which is such a great honor. I mean, so
and we have a little video piece that we can show.
Oh, good.
So let's run that now.
Okay, good. The mission of Life Story Theater is about the celebration of the mysteries and miracles of life. I grew up with lots of questions and grew up with lots of wonder. And somewhere in about the past 25 years, I came across a poem by Walt Whitman who said that he knows nothing else but miracles. And he went on to talk about everything as a miracle. And I thought, that's great. But then I thought, well, there are still questions I have about life. And what about that? And there was another poet named Rilke who talked about loving the questions. So it was it was somehow the two of them coming together was about appreciating, loving the questions, the miracles. So it's the mystery and the miracle. And so the work of the theater is about bringing those two together.
He is a very positive person, always a positive outlook.
Yeah, well, that's a lovely excerpt, too. I like that.
So, well, this has been wonderful.
Oh, thanks.
But we have
That's
to
great.
we're coming to the end of our time here, so we
Yeah.
have to wind up.
Oh, good. Well,
Thank
it's an
you
honor.
so much. There's so much more that we could have been talking about.
Well, thank you.